designed this course in order to bring a variety of people and a variety of voices into our class so that we can learn from them. 25 years the course has been going, and there has been great variety. Walter Capps, I think, always wanted to know about the consequences of the war on the real lives of people, and how this war would ultimately be integrated into the collective memory of the United States. Betty McDermott, our speaker today, is president of Betty McDermott and Associates, a leadership development company which was founded in 1962. She and her associates advise corporations and other institutions throughout the United States, in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. But she's more than that. She's a very special person for us because she received her BA degree here from UCSB. Before I got mine, actually, right? Now, in addition, she has been long devoted to our campus and its well-being and your welfare. She has served as a trustee of the University of California, Santa Barbara Foundation. She was the vice president of our Alumni Association and was a member of the Chancellor's Council. In addition to her professional activities of leadership development, Betty has held a number of other important leadership and executive positions, including the Robert Maynard Hutchins Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. She is a member in the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. She has been a part of the American Film Institute and the Actors Studio in New York City. Bruce Giffen is her son, and he is a very well-known person here in Santa Barbara as well. He is the CEO of Giffen and Crane General Contractors Incorporated. He is one of the members of the executive committee of the National Association of Home Builders, and he also serves as president of the Ealings Park Foundation in Santa Barbara. How many of you have been to Ealings Park? Isn't it one of the most beautiful parks in the city of Santa Barbara? It is. On a spring evening, there's nothing like Ealings Park. And probably we have you to thank for it. No? Keeping it that way. Today's class is devoted to Lieutenant Colonel Ross Faubert, the first American pilot claimed by a surface-to-air missile in the Vietnam War in 1965. Betty McDermott is the sister of Lieutenant Colonel Faubert, and he is the uncle of Bruce McGiffen. Lieutenant Colonel Faubert was 30 years old, just a few years older than many of you in this room, when his plane crashed. He was listed as an MIA, missing in action, and he did not return home with the hundreds of other prisoners of the war in 1973 during Operation Homecoming. Bruce Giffen was inspired to search for his uncle after his own eldest son was born in 1990, and after the renewed media attention given in the early 1990s to the situation of missing in action veterans and prisoners of war. Today we're going to hear a very dramatic story. It's the story of a family over almost 4 decades coping with loss, with hope. I'm not going to tell you Betty and Bruce's story, except to say that in many respects it is a true American story of 2 generations held together by the tragedy of the Vietnam War. This is a story about an individual, but this story reaches out to families who have lost in many wars and in many different circumstances. Please now welcome a very, very special guest, Betty McDermott.
Thank you. Good afternoon, students, faculty, friends, veterans. It is a privilege to be here to tell my family's story about the loss of my brother, Lieutenant Colonel Ross Faubert, As Richard said, the first American pilot shot down by the SAM missile in 1965 on his 55th and last mission before returning home. He was listed as missing for 36 years, and his remains were returned for funeral services and burial in Santa Barbara in 2001. I want to acknowledge Dr. Richard Hecht for inviting my son Bruce Giffen and me, and to thank Dr. Leonard Walcott for his support before, during, and after my brother's funeral, and for his umbrella today. I want to publicly acknowledge a person I've known, loved, and respected all my life, my son, Bruce Giffen. It took Bruce's tireless efforts to locate my brother's remains and to reunite my brother's North Vietnam squadron mates for the first time since the Vietnam War by bringing them to Santa Barbara in 2001 for my brother's funeral. I'm going to tell you a true story, and it's okay to laugh when we talk about serious things. 57 years ago, I was a UCSB freshman enrolled in Speech 101. To save you doing the math, I'm going to be 74 on my next birthday. Our first assignment was to research a poem about war, write a preamble to the poem before delivering it to the class. The preamble I wrote and read went, "The pathos of this beautiful poem, The Soldier, lies in the fact that the author, Rupert Brooke, a young soldier, was killed shortly after writing the poem." After speaking those lines, I began to see yellow, the room spun around me, and I fainted dead away on a hard cement floor. I was carried from class on a stretcher like a cold dead fish to the Student Health Center. When I came to, Dr. Snedeker, a very wise professor, had sent a note to me at the health center informing me that my poetry reading assignment was still due on Wednesday. Returning to class, the first thing Dr. Snedeker said was, "Betty, it's still your turn, and no more dramatic performances to illustrate a point." What a wise professor he was to get me back up on a horse after a bad fall. He set me free to give hundreds of speeches throughout the years, and I'm returning to UCSB to now speak for the second time. I promise not to faint today, but we are going to talk about a missing airman. And surveys show that people are more afraid of public speaking than of dying. I want to talk to you about the Vietnam War, how the loss of one Air Force officer altered the course of our lives, how we dealt with our grief, and what I've learned about grieving from personal experience and as a certified bereavement counselor. Perhaps sharing with you will assist you in dealing with losses that inevitably come to everyone. There is no single truth about the missing from the various wars our country has engaged in. There are many truths, and each of us who has lost someone sees life through the prism of our own experience. And it's important to note that men and women grieve very differently. In my field of human relations, there is a rule called the Rule of 250. It is estimated that each person has an average of about 250 relatives, friends, and acquaintances who would feel an emotional connection of joy if invited to that person's wedding, or much sorrow if invited to their funeral. The LA Times on January 10th stated that 88,000 Americans from our wars are still missing. Of that number, 1,970 are still missing from the Vietnam War. 58,000 American service personnel perished in Vietnam, and 3.4 million Vietnamese. Applying the rule of 250 to the 88,000 missing American men and women means that 22 million other Americans have been deeply emotionally impacted by their personal war losses. And we, Bruce and I, are just one family of those 88,000 core families. But in grieving, all people are equal. Any trauma forces the reality of human evil into the forefront of our awareness. We would all like to think we are in control of our lives. We want to think we are good people and that bad things happen only to bad people. Rabbi Kushner wrote a wonderful book with this title. Victims of wartime emotional trauma are members of society whose problems represent suffering, rage, and pain in a world that, once the trauma is acknowledged, longs to forget about it. While emotional trauma is described as a horrifically abnormal event, It has been a feature of history that has scarred billions of people, men, women, and children, since before the beginning of recorded history. Knowing this does not make the loss of a loved one any less painful. During the Vietnam War, a large segment of the population was turned off by the war, and it was a very painful time for this country. During this time, the U.S. experienced the greatest social depression since the Civil War. A social depression, not a financial depression. When individuals suffer personal depression, they experience feelings of anger, repressed rage, sadness, fear, helplessness, and hopelessness. In a social depression, large portions of the population experience great rage, sadness, fears, and a sense of helplessness to stop the way the government is controlling the destiny of millions. Many did not want to talk about the Vietnam War as it was going on or after, and those of us who experienced great personal losses found it often better to suffer in silence than to experience the many common humiliating remarks made to us, such as, "Get over it, move on, forget about him," when all we wanted was for people to ask, what kind of a person was he? Because the custom of wearing black armbands to identify the grieving disappeared long ago, many families members of the missing in action suffered severe and reactive depressions, leading to further loneliness and isolation, and some still suffer those feelings today. Finally, the League of Families of Missing Men in Vietnam was created in Washington, D.C. to bring families together, to put pressure on the government to continue searching for the missing men. Students at UCLA began a national movement to sell bracelets with the names of the missing to bring attention to this matter. And they sold thousands of these bracelets throughout the country. This is one that was returned to us recently. It was the people who wore it had it set in platinum, had this beautiful box made, and we've received quite a few bracelets that people wore for many, many years until they read in the Associated Press, the United Press, that my brother's remains had been returned. This put a lot of pressure on the government because these young UCLA students with this great idea kept hope alive. I want to tell you about my brother Ross, the boy and the man. He was born in Burke, South Dakota in 1935 and was just 30 years old when he was shot down in Vietnam. Our father was a small-town doctor. I was 5 years old when Ross was born and had not been told of his impending arrival. In those days, you were told that the stork would arrive at your house. Naturally, I was furious when I first saw this bundle and begged my doctor father to take him back. Fortunately, he refused. Ross's birth cost $15 for delivery and $2 a day for our mother's hospital room. The irony of this is it cost the Air Force thousands to recover his remains and bury him in Santa Barbara 36 years after his death. But Bruce and I are most grateful for that recovery. This 36 years of waiting for answers is what is known as disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief means that families have been denied the normal rites and rituals that should follow soon after a death. The family remains in a state of ambiguity and great discomfort and feels a lack of control. Families of murdered or kidnapped family members also experience the same type of grief. You may have felt like you were in a state of ambiguity when you were waiting to hear what college had accepted you or what organization of many wanted to employ you. But imagine having to wait 36 years for an answer. Ross's and my father died suddenly at Thanksgiving when I was 7 and Ross was 2, leaving our widowed mother almost penniless. The first year after my father's death, my mother baked whole wheat bread, which I placed in a little red flyer wagon each day to deliver door to door to sell for 17 cents a loaf. Oprah Winfrey says there are two kinds of poor. There's poor and there's po. Poor means that you had what you needed and not anything more, and po meant you didn't always have what you needed. We were po. As I reviewed the 30 years of Ross's life looking for clues about his destiny, it became obvious he was a born risk-taker, loved unreasonable heights, and said at a very early age he wanted to be a pilot. I used the red flyer wagon as a vehicle to sell bread, and Ross used it as a vehicle on a rickety roller coaster rail he built over a steep garage with the rails winding around and ending up in a potato field. I can still hear his whoops of joy as the wagon careened off the track, hurling it into the dirt. In 1944, World War II was deeply affecting the nation's economy. My widowed mother made the decision to leave South Dakota to relocate in California. She purchased a 14-foot homemade plywood trailer and hitched it up to the back of her 1934 Oldsmobile. Arriving in California, she parked the trailer in a Fontana orange grove so she could work at the Kaiser Steel Mill. Because there were only 2 single beds in the trailer and there were 3 of us, she worked the midnight shift at Kaiser so we could take turns sleeping. She later moved the trailer out onto the Mojave Desert, 35 miles from Barstow, north of Newberry Springs, in a very isolated area where they now have a lot of methamphetamine labs, but not then. As there were no other people around except when we went to school, Ross and I developed an unusually close bond of brother-sister friendship. As a way out of the confinement of our small living quarters, we spent hours befriending one another by hiking the desert and discovering and going into forbidden old mines. After I worked my way through UCSB, earning $40 a month, and tuition at that time was $42.50 a semester, and I'm sorry you have to pay a lot more now. But after I graduated from UCSB, I taught in the Covina Union High School district. Ross moved in with Bruce's dad and me to finish high school. He loved ham radios and was deeply into electronics. The bleeping signals and red flashing lights from electronic equipment in his room terrified me, but this was the beginning of Ross's abilities to design safety features later used on large aircraft. He was given the Bank of America Award for being an outstanding science student and joined the Air Force at 18. He became a navigator and later a fighter pilot. The day of President John F. Kennedy's assassination, my son Bruce, then 8, and I were on a train to Texas to attend the wedding of my brother to Anne Frank, the daughter of General and Mrs. Frank. Upon arrival in Texas, I was deeply disturbed by the number of people who were jubilant over the loss of our president, which to me was extremely tragic. The first night at Ross's Texas home, he showed me his list of goals and a timetable to achieve them. He shocked and surprised me by saying he intended to become an Air Force general. After all, we were the kids from South Dakota who had not been raised with high career expectations. When I asked him why a general, he said he had a mentor who constantly encouraged him to do his personal best. He pulled out a publicity release with my photo stating I'd been named National Spokeswoman for the California agricultural industry at Western Growers Association. Until that time, I hadn't realized we had been silently challenging each other. In 1965, Ross was called to Vietnam just a few days after the birth and the death of his baby son. His wife, Anne, was left behind in Tampa, Florida, grieving the loss of their first child and missing the one person who could comfort her most, her husband. Bruce and my mother were the last to see Ross off to Vietnam, and perhaps Bruce will tell you about that. When a loved one goes to an active war zone, there is a tremendous amount of anxiety in the family. On July 25, 1965, my husband and I had gone to Palm Springs to a writers' conference. Ross was due back from Vietnam the next week, but suddenly on Saturday I had a terrible feeling that something had gone wrong. At my urgent request, my husband agreed that we could leave the conference early. He stopped to buy a Los Angeles Times newspaper. Somehow I knew there would be a story about Ross on the front page, and I insisted he not open the paper. He thought I was a little crazy, but he listened to me. As we rolled into our driveway, I opened the paper, and there was a story of my brother's shoot-down. We had such a strong psychic connection that I got the message before my father-in-law came to the back gate and handed us the telegram. Between 1965 and 2001, I sought information any way I could about the MIAs by writing members of Congress, Presidents Johnson, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton. Once a year, I flew to Washington, D.C. on Air Force planes with other families who had missing loved ones to attend League of Families Missing Men meetings to gain support and to put continuing pressure on our government to find answers. When people lose someone dear in a traumatic way, in war or in peacetime, People have a need to try to get close to the site of the loss. Because of the war, this opportunity was denied me. On a business trip to the Orient in 1970, I flew from Taiwan over a badly smoking Hanoi and then went into northern Thailand, but was not allowed during the Yuban Air Base where Ross had been stationed. My mother and I spent hours at Edwards Air Force Base looking at thousands of pictures of missing men, hoping to spot Ross. We were exultant when we both at the same time yelled, "There he is!" Months later, after it was analyzed by the Air Force, we were informed it was someone else. The POWs were released in 1973. As the troops arrived in the Philippines, our hopes were high, but in a very terse phone call at 11 p.m., an Air Force member phoned to say he was sorry my brother was not listed with the POWs. That's all he said. At 5 a.m., I received the same call again. It had been 8 years. The newspaper listed the returnees. A few friends called, and Bruce and I were left to grieve alone again, but still holding out hope that somehow, somewhere, he'd be found. After a husband or son has been missing 8 years, the services declares that person MIA, RNR, missing in action, remains not recovered. So the wife can remarry. Ross's wife, Ann, married another Air Force officer almost immediately, so we endured another loss because we loved her so much. Many wives choose not to be in touch with the original family, depending on the second husband's wishes. All people rightfully need acceptance, acknowledgement, and a knowingness of the facts of what happened and completion. The word closure is often used improperly by the press and others. Losing a loved one is not an open and shut process like closing a box. Grieving a wartime trauma or any major loss requires a lot of emotionally hard work over a period of time. Another cliche people often use is time heals. Time heals nothing unless the bereaved do the grief work. Then acceptance of the loss is finally possible. A traumatic loss like my brother's, with 36 years of not knowing his status, ripped the rug right out from under me, and sometimes it felt like I had nothing to stand on. Sometimes I felt totally numb, and once I slept the whole night on a cold tile floor in a Canadian hotel just to feel something, anything, the sensation of cold giving me a sense of aliveness, because when we lose a loved one, a little part of ourself dies too. Grief books tell us about the 5 stages of grief: shock and denial, depression, guilt, anger, and acceptance. But these stages don't come in neatly wrapped packages on a predictable timetable. And denial, so often thought of as a negative state of mind, can be called to action. It's a force to keep the pressure on government officials to get the facts when they would just like to move on. When we love someone so deeply, the threads or the memories of our love are woven like a beautiful multicolored tapestry. When we lose that loved someone, those threads are broken, and we are flooded with memories that need to be shared and cherished. I was flooded with what ifs. What if he came back and I was depressed? Would he want that? No. What if he didn't come back and my life remained stagnant? I didn't want that either. Many of life's blessings come wrapped in pain. These blessings in disguise often reveal the opportunities they represent. During my soul-searching period, using prayer and meditation, I realized I needed to change careers. I had worked internationally developing consumer products for distribution and consumption in the United States. This work was no longer satisfying. A company in Sweden had asked me to work on developing a new design for a herring can and develop herring products. Well, I want to tell you that the world of corporate presidents is very small. And I did a successful job, and that president told the president of a company in Japan, and that president told the president of a company in Sweden and Denmark and Israel, and all of a sudden, thousands of pounds of fish started landing on our front doorstep. Thousands of cans of Del Monte tuna without labels asking to be tested. And so, I had gotten off center, And I had done one good job, and it led to many others, and the money was great, but you know money isn't everything. And so I had to ask myself, do I want to be chicken of the sea or captain of my ship? And I decided that I had to listen to my inner self, and what was that inner self going to be? My soul and spirit were demanding change, and when your soul and spirit speak to you, they don't do it quietly. They keep you awake at night. So the career path I chose was to assist people to develop their creative talents and their leadership skills. I went from the top of one profession to begin again in the field of human relations, management, and leadership studies. Went back to school, trained with the best people in the country, covering all facets of human relations, and it's a change I've never regretted. I found that when you're serving your true life purpose, surprising things happen. I began by volunteering my time to lead weekend seminars. Unbeknown to me, the chief psychologist for the Navy happened to be a participant in one of them. As a result, I was employed by the first woman contractor to be in charge of leadership training for officers and chiefs at the Navy Leadership Academy for Seabees at Port Hueneme, a position I held for 9 years. This was a great healing time for me and for those in the training who had served in Vietnam and Beirut and were suffering post-traumatic syndrome. So we did a lot of mutual healing by being together. Invited aboard the SS Norton Sound, I was stunned to find out how the surface-to-air missiles works that had killed my brother. A man sits at a computer on an upper deck, far away from the missile on the deck. When he sees an aircraft on the screen, he pushes a button, a plane is down, and a family suffers the loss forever. It's so simple, it's so clean, and it is so horrible. After a big loss, redemption comes when the grieving is no longer external, when anger, bitterness, and resentment have been purged from your being through the long process of forgiveness. You've had the rites and rituals as we had in April 2001. You can now bring your loved one's spirit into your being as one you will always love and remember. To conclude, I would like to say to the students, we live in a noble country, but a country whose image has been greatly tarnished. This is my charge to you. Use the wonderful educational foundation you are receiving here at UCSB to serve as a springboard to do your part to create a better world. Believe in yourself, and if you ever find yourself engaging in self-doubt, remember the words of the little Chicago girl from the projects who said, God don't ever make no junk. Look deep within yourself to let your heart, soul, and spirit reveal your life purpose. With passion, set goals to serve your purpose. Then move out into the world with confidence, knowing that you, with your span of influence of the 250 people, can make a huge difference by doing your personal best. And believe, truly believe, that if you are challenged by trauma and loss, your spirit and your soul will spring into action to give you the strength you never knew you had: faith, hope, love, and compassion. For example, how many here have seen the big white arrow on the FedEx sign? How many have seen the big white arrow? So 3 or 4 people have seen it, okay? It's always been there. It's right here. And it's a sign of forward progress that is a design element for FedEx. But faith, hope, and love are always within us, and sometimes we don't see them, and they're intangible. But if you learn to trust those intangible elements in your character, then it's going to be a wonderful life for you. Then men like my brother, Lieutenant Colonel Ross Faubert, will not have died in vain. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. Put this down. Thank you. Thank you.
Excuse me. Well, I'm Bruce Giffen, and it's truly an honor to be here today to speak to you. On every board, there's heads. And he and my mother were extremely close. He flew in very often to visit and to see us, and I felt very close to him as a little kid growing up. And I remember the last time that he and some squadron mates came to see us before deploying to Vietnam. It was probably a few weeks before they went. 4 guys flew in 2 F-4s, landed and came to visit, and they spent the night at my mom's house, and we had a great family get-together. Great American breakfast, orange juice, Danish pastries, scrambled eggs, bacon, that smell of that breakfast, that American breakfast. And my grandparents were there, and my mother's mother was there, and it was that kind of American thing, and these 4 young guys, all in the prime of their lives, smart, intelligent, and they were going to this place called Vietnam. And I didn't know where Vietnam was. All I knew that it was on the front page of the LA Times every morning that I would pass on my way to the comics. I didn't know what it meant. I never heard of it. But they were going there, and they believed in what they were doing, and you could feel the sense of that energy that they had, and that, they were flying the most powerful American fighters on the face of the planet, and they were going to go tackle this little country that was all about communism. And my grandmother and I drove them out to George Air Force Base out near Apple Valley, and it was myself and the 4 guys and my grandmother, and I was squished in between her and my uncle in the front seat of her 1962 green Rambler with green seats, and it still had the plastic over the seats because she wanted to protect it. And there was a very green world with these guys in their green flight suits and me. And we went out there, and we got out and we drove out to the flight line, and my uncle said a few last words to his mother. I don't know what he said. And then he gave me a big hug, and he said, "Stick around." And they got into their F-4s and very loud planes that day, and they taxied down, and it seemed like to a little 9-year-old that it was forever and a day, and I was like, "Can we go?" And she whirled at me and said, "No." He said, "Stick around," and we're sticking around. And so then they came in a formation takeoff. The 2 jets came flying down, and they took off, and they went around, and they put out this great smoky trail. And they turned around, and they came back, and they did a low pass right in front of it, and they waggled their wings. And they took off, and that was the last I ever saw my uncle. So I'm going to show you some slides, if we could dim the lights, and see if I can get this going here. This is my uncle's on top, Ross Faubert, and this is his pilot. They were both pilots at that point in time. That was what the Air Force believed. Later on, the backseater was not a pilot, but in this day and age, everyone who flew in the F-4 were pilots. Ross was a backseater. And this was in their F-4. It was a picture taken in Ubon Ratchathani, very close to the eastern edge of Thailand. And this is in early July in 1965, and they were part of Lyndon Johnson's campaign called Rolling Thunder, which was an initial strategy to try and bomb the Vietnamese back to the negotiating table, where they would bomb a target and a few targets and see if the Vietnamese would come to the negotiating table and do that. And Ross was part of the very first squadrons that were into as part of that, and they went in April at that point in time. I think, the dark circles under the eye gives you kind of a sense of what was going on in terms of lack of sleep and stress and pressure. As they flew over North Vietnam, they could watch the Soviets building these surface-to-air missile sites, which were off limits as far as attacking because they might kill Soviets. And they were concerned about expanding the political nature of the war. They'd also gotten intelligence that they had brought in mobile surface-to-air missiles, and they didn't know exactly where they were. And on the incoming squadron, they were there, Ross's squadron was there for about 4 months, and he had flown 55 missions over North Vietnam. And on the last mission, they had brought the incoming squadron, and they said to the new pilots, "You're going to fly this mission in with these guys because they're going to show you the routes." And so Ross was in the back seat guiding them in or flying along with them, and his pilot wasn't a part of that. And they were flying in between 2 cloud layers at 24,000 feet, 45 miles northwest of Hanoi, and a surface-to-air missile came right up between the clouds, just missing them. They were in a flight of four airplanes, and two of the airplanes were the squadron commanders, the one outgoing and the one coming in. And they both described that they watched the first missile just miss in between them, and a split second later, the second missile hit Ross's aircraft and lifted it up and flipped it over upside down, and it caught on fire. And the other planes diverted around, and they thought that they saw two ejection seat pods before they disappeared into cloud cover. And that was the last we heard about Ross and his pilot on that mission for a year. And then they marched the pilots through the streets of Hanoi, and his pilot showed up on that newsreel footage. So all of a sudden we knew at least one had survived, and then there was hope. And one of the things I think you have whenever there's somebody missing is you always have hope. You always hold out, well, what if? What if they survive the shoot down? What if they survive the ejection? What if they survive being captured? What if the Soviets found out who they had because they had very good intelligence? What if they discovered that this young man named Ross Faubert was really an electronics whiz kid who earlier in his career had been creating black boxes to foil their radar defenses from Turkey into the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War? What if they had captured him and taken him away? And that's what families hold on to without a body, is that what if. This is Ross as a young airman, and he always had a great smile. He always had a full-toothed smile right there, and that's just who he was. And his squadron mates told these incredible stories about the warmth that he had and who he was, this young kid who grew up in the desert. And here we are at the weekend after the assassination of JFK at his wedding, with my great-aunt Bert on the far left, my grandmother on the left, Ross and Ann and myself, and my mother, and then Ann's mother over there. He was obviously a devoted brother, as you've heard Mom speak about, in terms of being there, being supportive, coming to see her, and young, full of hope. In fact, he gave her away at her wedding. And here he is as a young kid with my mother and my grandmother. And my mother tells a great story about, as you can see, the steps are quite high. And one of Ross's first flying experiments was be sure that a truck inner tube would carry the two of them around the neighborhood, and that they would need to tie orange crates onto it to hold it down for ballast. And I think he encouraged my mother to be the test pilot, to jump off of this with the inner tube. And I think she said, next time you go first. So this is what I grew up with. And I really, in 1990, my oldest son was born. There was a picture on the cover of Newsweek that turned out later on to be doctored, but it showed 3 POWs in their 50s standing in a rice paddy. And it began a what if. And so I held my son in my hand. I said, there's a continuity here, and there's pictures of Ross holding me in that same place as a baby. And I wanted to know, who was this man? And I got his service record, and I wanted to find out what he did, and what did his friends think of him? What did he do? Who was he? Part of his family. And then in 1994, they're sending young American servicemen over there who are fluent in Vietnamese to do these investigations in these various villages, and they interviewed villagers in a village, and they thought that they had a correlation between their stories and Ross's shoot down. But some of the stories didn't seem quite accurate, and so I really wanted to go, but they said, no, you can't go. And then they went back again and re-interviewed, and they re-interviewed the villagers, and they said, yes, actually, we told you last time that we encountered him on this mountain. It was actually on this mountain over here. And so the Americans went up there and they found an impact site, and they found pieces of an American airplane. And the villagers said, yeah, and we buried him here. And so based on that, they said, well, we're going to come back and do an excavation in 1997 in November. And so when we got that news at the family briefing in Washington, D.C., I said, great, and I'm going to see you there. Because I know you can't support me, I know you can't pay my way, and I know I can't go with you as part of your government team, but I'm going to be there. And so this is the old quarters of Hanoi, and Hanoi is an incredible city. As you see kids here doing physical education, market goods going to school, a man on the right doing blacksmithing. This Hanoi is in 1997, just as this environment is placed. City of 2 million and only 4 traffic signals. This is the hotel where I stayed at. It was 6 stories tall and 9 feet wide. And being from California, one of my first questions was, once I saw my room, was, well, do you have earthquakes here? And they said, no, only tsunamis, but none are forecast in the foreseeable future. And this is one of the amenities of the hotel. This was my driver, who anywhere I wanted to go in Hanoi, on the back of like a Honda 90 was part of the goods. And then this is the statue commemorating the shoot-down of Senator McCain. And this is an image that you see a lot of places, a theme and an image of the little country beating the big country. It's very important to the Vietnamese culture that they tell their upcoming generations about, here's where we captured, or here's where we beat the big country. It's a little hard to see. Down low of the round object is Senator McCain's head and flight helmet, and he's being held up by his Vietnamese captors. And it's overlooking the lake where he parachuted into in the center of Hanoi. This is this was in the Vietnamese Air Force Museum. It shows the routes that our fighters and bombers flew into North Vietnam. And down there in the very lower center in the dark portion is where Ubon Ratchathani is in Thailand, and they would fly up and over and then into Hanoi, which is the red star that's there. And one of the things that some of our pilots really wondered is how come every time they flew over North Vietnam, everyone was shooting at them. And then one of them who was captured, it was as a POW, who commented, he was like, we flew them like the airlines did. We flew missions in at 7, 3 p.m. and sunset, like clockwork. So when we flew in, they would pick up their rifles out of the rice paddies and everyone would be shooting us because we were on time. This is what's called B-52 Pond. It's in a suburb of Hanoi, and it's where a bomber, a B-52 bomber, the wreckage of remains from Richard Nixon's Christmas bombing campaign of 1972. And the Vietnamese, it's another icon of showing the little country beating the big country, and they left it there. And over there by the red umbrella, you can go get a Coca-Cola and sit and observe and think about B-52 Pond. At the time, there were none of these homes were there. These are villas, and I think most of them are owned by customs officials who get paid in favors. But this is this wreckage that remains. Another shot of it. And we were there for about an hour, and this man went back and forth probably 15 times in that hour, wheeling this bicycle full of bricks. He'd wheel it down to build one of these villas, offload it, bring it back empty, fill it back up full of hundreds of pounds of bricks, and bring it back again. And he smiled at me every single time. And I thought, this is what was on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. These bikes, these guys like ants. And we would come in with our F-4s and our B-52s and carpet bomb or go after what we could and put holes on it. And meanwhile, these guys would push their bikes around the holes in the ground. I just thought this was sort of the problem that we had in trying to win that war. This is the infamous Hanoi Hilton. There's not much left of it now. There's actually a quite large skyscraper behind it, and they left one barracks and some walls. This is where my uncle's front seater spent 7 3/4 years in captivity. This is Ambassador Pete Peterson, our first ambassador back to Vietnam after the normalization of relations. One of the things that you see about people who have survived combat is that there's something in their eyes. He's one of them. Pete was also a POW. He was also in the Hanoi Hilton. He also knew Ross's front seater. He also bombed the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And when you talk to Pete, he really believed in what he was doing and that he was quite effective about it. He was also building reconciliation between our two countries. And then on the other side of the table is this man who's sitting there in the white shirt. He also experienced the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but from a different perspective. He was one of the truck drivers. And he talked about what it was like and how they would sit there and wait for the F-4s to go and then drive on, and said, did you ever lose friends? And he said, oh yeah, all the time. So what would you do? He said, well, we'd pull them out of the truck and bury them by the side of the road and put a wooden stake in the ground in the hopes that we remember where they were, and we'd drive on. And he said, well, did you ever shoot back? No. Why not? Wasn't my job. My job was to drive truck. And you see that time and time again in the Vietnamese culture, is that they're given a job, and in a situation like this, they do it until they're either dead or the job is done. This is the Vietnamese road building crew on the way out to the site. There was one man in the crew, actually he's down there holding things up. Normally he's on top of the tractor. The rest of the crew is women. And this is into the village that's closest to my uncle's crash site. It's about 4.5 hour drive. The last hour and a half was on this dirt road into it, and the mountains were teeming with people. It just filled full of people. This is my first view of the impact site of where Ross's shoot down occurred, and I was really struck how similar it was to our own mountains here in Santa Barbara. Similar elevation, similar geographic location, facing south, southeast. And that hillside where it looks like we might think it's chaparral, it's actually manioc that they used to feed the pigs. They were using it to eat at that point in time during the Vietnam War, but now they use it to feed the pigs. And you can see the laborers up there working, and then the crew has erected a blue tarp shelter to get out of the heat and sun during break time. And then these are the kids in the village there, that kids are kids everywhere you go. And they were really intrigued by the camera and the gear and all. And when we first went out there, we were told that we needed to bring our own food because our Vietnamese government minders who accompanied us were going to be treated to a special VIP lunch, but that we weren't invited to be that, but the VIP lunch was going to be put on by the village elders there. And so this is the nicest home in the village there. Most of the homes that were mud, thatch, wattle, and dub huts. It was very much a third world country, even though it's only 45 miles as the crow flies. It's very much what our government minders called an ethnic tribal minority area. And these two men here said that they buried my uncle. And so we're talking with them, and I gave them candy dishes to them that was engraved from the family of Lieutenant Colonel Ross Faubert to them. And this was another man who said that he also buried my uncle. And then it was up to the crash site, and all these little stalks are manioc, and what you see are the red flags there are the hits or pings from the metal detector. And we sent in a team of 11 American troops, and they all have specialties, and one of them is trained in dealing with unexploded ordnance. And so he's going through there with a metal detector so that if anything needs to be defused, he can do it. And these are all the metal fragment hits that he was getting. This is the young captain who was in charge of this. The guys volunteered to go over there. They received no hazardous duty pay. They do it as a labor of love, 30 days in country at a time. He was a veteran of the first Gulf War, and now he was over here. And then down below, you can see the valley that the crash site overlooked, and it's probably looked that way for a couple of thousand years. And here you see the team of laborers that are hired, and it's quite a deal of negotiation to get them, and we pay the Vietnamese government $30 a day at that time, and the laborers were paid $1.50 a day in cash. And there is no cash in this area. It's a third world country, so this is big money for this to happen, to make it happen. And there's a lot of negotiation going on. And before you can dig up, you have to negotiate with the village elders about the loss of crop value that they're going to get. And so on the one hand, you have this young American captain who's trying to negotiate with them, who's being told by the Vietnamese he's the cheapest American they've ever encountered. And on the other hand, he's being told by his superior officers in Hanoi that he's paying triple the going rate. And you can see it's a fairly steep side of the hill. And here's where they're excavating the initial burial pit where they were told that he was buried. Nothing was really found that day. But I knew once I stood on that mountain that I knew he had died there. And up until that moment, I wasn't sure. I just always had held out hope. But once I climbed up the side of that mountain, I knew he had died there. And I knew it was okay, that it was a peaceful place, and he hadn't known what had hit him. And he went very quickly. And so in many regards, that was not a bad way to go. The next day, we were back to Hanoi. This is the Hanoi War Museum. It's a very old structure. It was originally built around the year 1000. And again, war is a large part of the Vietnamese history, and so they have this whole museum dedicated to telling their story of war as a culture, about survival as a culture. In the courtyard is this exhibit of various pieces from what they call the American War. This is a mobile surface-to-air missile. This was similar to what was used to shoot him down. And then they've created this montage, this sculpture of various aircraft parts and pieces. And then I almost didn't find it. I wandered through the whole museum and I almost didn't see the 1965 wing of the exhibit hall. And there it was. There's the piece commemorating the shoot-down, their first shoot-down, a historic first for them in their war against us, of an American aircraft. And for me, it was the shoot-down of someone very close to us, my uncle. This is what they say they used to shoot him down, a very early Soviet version of a surface-to-air missile launching device. Interesting enough, the Soviets and private correspondents take credit for it. Of course, publicly, the Vietnamese take credit for it. And so there you are, face-to-face in a museum, staring at an exhibit of a device that was used to kill one of your relatives. And then all of a sudden you think about those swords that were on display from the year 900 that have nicks in them, nicks in the blade. And then you begin to think about how many other families have been impacted by weapons of war that are on display in that museum. This is the man, this little man in the white suit or white shirt there. He was in charge of Hanoi's air defense at that time, and he talked about how even if the Americans had bombed the dikes to flood the city, that they were always determined to win. They were always going to win. And I asked him about the shoot down of my uncle, if it was a momentous day for them at all. And he said, "Oh no, we knew it was going to happen. It was just a matter of time." At the same time, there were 4 other Americans over there, and they were doing a similar thing, a similar quest for one of their buddies who was shot down farther north. And actually, I just got an email from them the other day. The search is still going on, and they think they have found his remains, so they are getting the beginning of closure. Went back to the crash site. They found nothing at the burial site, so they decided to go back and excavate where the plane had impacted. They dig it down as an archaeological dig to the point of where they reach sterile soil. Nothing has been touched below that point. They found fragments of a crash helmet there. They went back and re-interviewed the witnesses who said, well, maybe it wasn't here where we buried him, maybe it was over there, or maybe it was over there, or maybe it was over there. And so they started excavating back and forth across the mountainside and to see what they could find. It's incredible the amount of work and effort, and it is truly amazing the amount of money that we spend in search of these guys who are missing. But isn't that the American way? I mean, oftentimes you hear a story about multiple guys going back in to rescue somebody and losing their own lives trying to save one guy. And here's the bucket brigade. So as they dig out, pieces, half a bucket is taken out and taken down to the screening boxes down at the far end. And the screening boxes are moved back and forth. And before each one is turned over after they screened it, an American looks through it for bones or artifacts or anything at all that they might find. And they move these poles around. They keep raising the screening boxes higher and higher as they put more and more dirt. And then they keep moving them around and around the mountainside to make it work. Here they are going higher and higher up as a place to work. And now they're beginning to excavate back and forth across the mountain. They've given up on the gravesite. One of the things that we always asked when we were there was, well, where did you bury him? Where did you bury him? None of us ever thought, well, did you ever dig him up? So now they're excavating back and forth across the mountain, and what they're beginning to find are a few artifacts on what would be a dry stream that would have water running in it in the wet season of the year. This is Denny Danielson, who's the civilian anthropologist in charge of this dig. He was also a Marine Corps combat veteran, did 2 tours, 65 and 67. At that point in time, he'd done 36 digs and recovered remains on 18 of them. He certainly did this as a mission of love and for the guys that he knew that were close to him. And And this is the Captain Todd Heiser, who was in charge of the group. And I'm sorry I don't recall these folks' names anymore, but he was a medic. And this is a Vietnamese. He and his family were lifted off the rooftop of the U.S. Embassy in 1975. He's now a staff sergeant in the U.S. Army. He was the linguist. This man was in charge of the unexploded ordnance. And he was a mortuary affairs. He's one of the guys who would deal with the remains. And this guy here was the medic. And then she was the photographer for the team. And this was a Filipino-American, and he was also a Navy SEAL and in charge. And these are just American faces. And you look at these teams of young folks over there doing it as a labor of love. And then this is where we put 30 flowers at the spot where they found a tooth, a left front molar. And that was all they found of him. They found a 1964 American penny buried 18 inches in the ground. They found zipper tabs that they identified would have been off of his flight suit, his G suit, survival vest. They found a .38 caliber bullet that would have been in his survival kit. And so this is the remnants of what they found of one man to demonstrate that he was there. So I keep thinking about, we all have hopes, dreams, and ambitions, and Ross certainly had his, and one of the things I think we have to be very careful of, that when we commit American troops to go off to far-off places to fight for our way of life and our culture and our values, that we really have a clear understanding of the purpose of why we're there. Because quite frankly, our country really can't afford too many more Vietnams, because we can't afford to lose people like this.